You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 13th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Briefing, in association with Addis. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Washington, D.C. comes under federal control. We'll discuss the politics and the realities on the ground. After that,
the EU is extremely active on all fronts to support Ukraine and put Ukraine in a position of strength.
EU leaders and Ukraine hope to convince Donald Trump not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when he meets Vladimir Putin. We'll also get the latest from Poland 1 week into a new presidency. We'll get the latest business headlines, and finally,
winter in the north is dry. There's beautiful, clear blue sky, crisp air, and just lovely game watching available at that time.
Cape Town's booming restaurant scene with Luke Dale Roberts. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The National Guard, normally reserved for times of major upheaval, has been out on the streets of the U.S. Capitol in the last day, its Humvees rolling past the Washington Monument and other landmarks, as an order by Donald Trump for a federal takeover of Washington, D.C. begins to take effect. So far, despite the optics, it does all appear to have gone relatively smoothly. But to tell us more, I am joined now by H.J. Mai, Washington journalist and correspondent for Germany's Tageszeitung out there. H.J., good to have you back on the show. Let's start with the mood in D.C. It will be a strange sight. I've lived in D.C. as well, as you know. I can only imagine what it's like to see these Humvees and National Guard on the streets.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, as you mentioned, you've been here, you've seen, that there's a lot of law enforcement and even military presence, when there are big events like obviously earlier this year, the inauguration, or we had the military parade, a couple months ago. But this feels different, obviously. It's early August. School just started up, and now you once again have a military presence here. So it's interesting. I was riding my bike along the mall yesterday, and as you mentioned, you saw Humvees, you saw federal officers, from the drug and DEA, from the drug enforcement. You saw National Guard. You saw obviously local police, and yeah, it's a different feel. And the mood, I mean, within the city, it's split. As you know, this is a very heavily democratic city. So in general, it seems like a lot of people are to some degree afraid what this all means. But there are also other people who say, yes, the city has a crime problem, and maybe this helps to some degree. Well, the majority of people thinks, yes, he talked about the right issues. This city has a crime issue, but the way to address it with more law enforcement, with this federal takeover, is just the wrong way to go about it.
When it comes to addressing it, as you say there, HJ, the National Guard, the Secret Service, Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, FBI, Park Service, there are so many different groups involved in addition to the local DC police. Do we have any sense of how this is all going to fit together practically on the ground?
No, to be honest, not really. That's still a work in progress. I talked to a couple officials here from the city council in DC, and it's still, they're talking to federal officials, they're talking to, the Justice Department, and it's still people trying to figure out who's in charge, who is allowed to give orders. The way it's been communicated to me, on this Wednesday morning is that at the moment when it comes, for example, to the takeover of the Metropolitan Police Department, or the local police department here in D.C., it's still the same chain of command. So the current police chief, Pamela Smith, is still the one who's in charge of the force. It's also a question, how, troops from the National Guard, for example, who are not really, trained to be really law enforcement officials. Yes, they come in when there's big protests for crowd control and those type of things. But, it's hard to imagine that you just have, like you have with police, that you have two National Guard guys just walking the street looking for, petty crime and stuff. So it's still very much a work in progress.
And speaking of that work in progress and trying to sort it out, I know Mayor Muriel Bowser has called this an sort of authoritarian takeover by the Trump administration, but she has also met with the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, for example, yesterday. Is there a disconnect right now between the political optics with what Trump has said this is about and how officials are working on actually implementing it in the city?
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, from a democratic perspective, this seems like another distraction. That's what it's been called. When it comes to the meeting, that the Mayor Bowser had with Pam Bondi at the Justice Department yesterday, as you mentioned, the mayor has been outspoken that she disagrees with that decision. The city has made progress in fighting crime over, recent years. But she's willing to work with the federal government to implement this. I mean, at the moment, this takeover, as it's been called, will last for at least 30 days, and then there would have to be some congressional involvement. But yes, there's clearly still some work in progress when it comes to the politics behind it, where Trump wants to continue this tough policy, tough on crime, tough on immigration, tough on homelessness, to be honest, and then also the actual workaround in how to implement all of it. There's definitely a disconnect so far. I mean, this morning it's day 3 or the start of day 3 of this takeover. So we will see how those conversations move ahead, and if the federal government has another surprise coming.
And what about other cities, finally, HJ? Because Washington, D.C. is obviously a special case. The Trump administration has an authority. It has the power to do what it is doing there just because of sort of the special situation that Washington finds itself in as a capital without a state. But there are reports that say the Pentagon is readying the broader deployment of the National Guard in the U.S. How does that all fit together?
Yeah, Trump himself mentioned it during his press conference on Monday. He warned cities like Baltimore, Chicago, even New York City that, if they're not doing a better job with crime and clean up their cities, that, he could try to, force them and send troops there to, change how they run their cities. As you mentioned, D.C. is clearly a special case. The federal government has a lot to say here. I mean, it's still, controlling the purse strings and basically the laws that are created by the city council get a second look by Congress. So there are a lot of questions. But given the way this administration has, implemented other parts of its agenda, there's clearly concern in other cities and to see if, the government might just go ahead without having a legal backing initially, and then it has to, work its way through the court system. So there is concern in a city like Chicago, in Baltimore, if this could happen. And yeah, we will see where this goes. But the legal setup here in DC is obviously different than in other cities, and that makes it a little bit more challenging for the federal government to institute something that, this is happening here now.
H.J. Mai, journalist, including for Tageszeitung in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. And now here's Tom Webb with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have vowed to strengthen cooperation after speaking on the phone. Putin expressed appreciation for the self-sacrificing spirit of the Korean People's Army, referring to North Korea's role in repelling Ukrainian forces in the border region. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has suggested that ceasefire efforts in Gaza are now focused on a comprehensive deal that would release the remaining hostages all at once. Hamas has long called for a comprehensive deal, but says it will only release the remaining hostages in return for the release of Palestinians imprisoned by Israel. Korean air passengers flying economy on their revamped Boeing jets will find an extra seat in each row and one less inch. Starting in September, each row will grow from 9 seats to 10, reducing seat width from 18 to 17 inches. The move is part of their $200 million investment to upgrade their fleets to make more space for premium economy seats. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Tom. Now, while Putin has been huddling with Kim Jong-un, as you just heard in those headlines, Donald Trump will be huddling later today with Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders in a highly anticipated digital meeting before his summit with Putin on Friday. As ever, the question is whether Trump will listen to any of the advice that he's given by Ukraine or his European counterparts, who are urging the U.S. president not to leave Ukraine out of any ceasefire deal he might agree to. Well, joining me now is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, always good to have you on the show. I want to start with, I guess, the tactics of this, the approach. How do we think that Zelensky and Europe will go about this meeting? Because they have probably learned at this point that they can't make too many demands without annoying Donald Trump.
Hi there, Chris. Well, there's going to be a few preamble meetings and gatherings to sort of game this out and strategize before they get the chance to speak to not just Donald Trump, the US president, but his equally mercurial and firebrand Vice President J.D. Vance, who, remember, is here in the United Kingdom enjoying a holiday. All of these people will be dialing in for this virtual summit, which will include leaders of the key bodies of the European Union. Remember, it was convened by Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, as an opportunity for Europe to pitch its case and also to include Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, in any preamble conversations before we have this tete-a-tete between Trump and Vladimir Putin at the end of the week. There's three objectives here, I suppose, that they really have. On the one hand, they want to try and get the sequence right. They want to make sure that Trump doesn't exceed or acquiesce to any demands by Russia, particularly when it comes to conceding Ukrainian territory, before any kind of ceasefire is actually in place, set in stone, and that the borders of the current conflict are frozen where they are. And they probably also want to try and get some security guarantees, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe, to make sure that whichever footprint of Ukrainian territory may be offered, that won't be a launch pad for future attacks on the rest of Ukraine, and therefore to challenge the EU and NATO in a few years down the line. And finally, I suppose really what they're hoping is to be the last person in the room to have had a chance to speak to Donald Trump before he sits down, by the way, without translators, we understand, on Friday in Anchorage in Alaska. Because if there's one thing that both Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and the Prime Minister of the UK, Sir Keir Starmer, have learned recently, it's that the last person to speak to the US president often gets a chance to press their case better.
That said, Nina, I do understand that Trump has also spoken, for example, with Viktor Orban of Hungary, who refused to sign a statement by EU members on Ukraine yesterday. Might he leave more of a lasting impression on Trump?
Well, you're right to say that there was a statement just yesterday trying to remind the US president that, conflicts and no ways of grabbing territory and unilaterally changing countries' borders, and also the 26 members of the 27 bloc, so that means excluding Hungary, went ahead and issued a statement saying that, no lasting peace could be agreed without Ukraine being part of that agreement. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but essentially that's the gist of it, and the one outlier appears to be Hungary, and the EU appears to be willing to move ahead without Hungary. Just an idea of who's going to be on this call with the US president later on. We've got all sorts of members of the EU from all corners. Merz of Germany, of course, Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, who, remember, has a big long border with Russia that they're worried about. Emmanuel Macron has been steering some of these conversations, and Giorgia Meloni, who's been a very effective Trump whisperer from Italy, and Donald Tusk as well, the Prime Minister of Poland, which has been spending an awful lot on US military over the last few years with US defense contracts. So these are people alongside Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, who has emerged as another surprisingly successful Trump whisperer as well for NATO, who perhaps can counteract that irksome presence that they have on their eastern flank in the form of Hungary's Viktor Orban.
Nina, when it comes to this actual meeting that's happening on Friday, I mean, Donald Trump has in some ways tried to play this down, I suppose. He said this is, a planning meeting, that of course Zelensky and others would be involved at a later stage. I mean, maybe it's playing a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but for Europeans, Is that something that they should take at face value? I mean, what's wrong with Trump having a sort of planning meeting with Putin as long as Ukraine gets a say later?
Well, where to start? On US territory that is a symbolic piece of US territory because it was bought as probably not prime real estate, Donald Trump might have thought back in those days, but that was before oil was discovered, I suppose, from Russia back in the late 1860s for about $7 million US. So this is very, very important symbolically that they're meeting in what was previously Russian territory that was acquired by Donald Trump. Remember, he's talked about trying to acquire territory in other parts of the world, like, for instance, parts of Canada or Greenland and so on and so forth. So that speaks to something that has been a recurring theme in Donald Trump's international diplomacy. And also remember that he went into this meeting saying, well, look, there's going to have to be some land swapping. That, of course, raised concerns, obviously in Ukraine and also in Europe. The Ukrainian President Zelensky said, well, look, we can't constitutionally just hand over parts of our land. We've been at war since 2022 trying to defend that. That irritated Donald Trump yet again. And therefore, we've seen this situation where the White House has backtracked. They've started to say, well, no, this is just a listening exercise. But either way that you look at it, there is a warrant in the International Criminal Court that, by the way, neither Russia nor the United States actually are signatories to, that would like to see the Russian President Vladimir Putin arrested. And there will be many human rights activists who will raise their eyebrows at the spectacle of a meeting on US territory that used to be Russian territory between these two key leaders to decide the fate of Europe and potentially decide the fate of Ukraine without any of those two other parties being present around the table. So that is why this preamble call is so significant. And just after they will have spoken, these EU leaders, to J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, there will thereafter be a debrief with the so-called coalition of the willing. And that is probably a sort of, oh dear, what now moment. That will be Keir Starmer convening those countries that may well have to try and defend Europe if the United States pulls back and tries to force a difficult peace deal upon Ukraine.
Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. Thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. It's been a week since Poland inaugurated a new president, backed by the same right-wing alliance as his predecessor, but also embodying a few further right qualities, shall we say, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, which we've just been talking about. The question, even after a week, remains just how difficult Karol Nawrocki can make life for the government of Donald Tusk. Well, I'm joined now by Alex Szczerbiak, author of the Polish Politics blog. And Alex, I wanted to start with Ukraine, since we have just been discussing this meeting of EU leaders with Trump. Donald Tusk will be part of that meeting as well. What kind of backing can he expect to have from Nawrocki?
Well, Karol Nawrocki is very much within the consensus within Polish politics, which is that Ukraine needs to be supported diplomatically, militarily, in terms of humanitarian aid. There's no change really on that front. I think that where there is a difference in the approach that Mr. Nawrocki is going to have with the Ukrainian issue is that he's going to be much more instrumental in how he approaches the war in Ukraine. So he'll say that whereas Poland and Ukraine have an overarching common interest in preventing Russian expansionism and aggression, particularly in Ukraine, they are areas where they have different interests over things like historical issues, over things like the sale of Ukrainian agricultural goods, which he feels unfairly competes with Polish farmers. And he will say that the government of Poland needs to be much more assertive on those areas where their interests are different, that it needs to use the fact that Ukraine needs Polish support to advance its interests in those areas where they clash with its eastern neighbours.
And do we have a sense already at this point of how Nawrocki might go about implementing sort of some of those beliefs that he has, whether it's on Ukraine or on domestic politics as well, because he's not involved in the day-to-day governing. How is he making his presence felt so far?
He's not, that's right. But he does have some powerful constitutional instruments. They're mainly about blocking the government. So this is a suspensive veto on legislation which can only be overturned with a 3/5 parliamentary majority, which the government doesn't have. So, for example, in areas like judicial reform, where they would like to try and undo their predecessors' reforms, he's made it clear that he will block them on that, or moral cultural issues, things like abortion, the state recognition of same-sex civil partnerships. So that's obviously one instrument that he has, which is a negative instrument, very powerful instrument. But much more important are the political dynamics that are set off by his victory. He pitched the election as a referendum on the government. This is widely how it's perceived. And the fact that he has this huge mandate, more people voted in this election than in any presidential election up until now, means that he can insert himself in political debates in order to influence them. And that's particularly true about foreign affairs and security issues, because the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He chairs the Polish National Security Council, and that means that whatever his formal constitutional powers, he can actually influence those debates much more fundamentally because of the huge electoral mandate that he has, more than any other elected politician in Poland.
And how then is Donald Tusk, as the Prime Minister, dealing with this? Have you seen any signs in the last week or so? As mentioned, he's on this call when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, is this business as usual for Tusk, albeit in a difficult environment, or are you seeing some sort of signs of shifting tactics?
I still think that Mr. Tusk and the government are coming to terms with Mr. Nawrocki's victory. They weren't expecting it, and they clearly didn't have a plan B. So a lot of what they're doing at the moment is, there was a government reshuffle the other day. They appointed a government spokesperson for the first time. This is all sort of very reactive, but playing to a kind of an old playbook. I think what they will be hoping is that Mr. Nawrocki overreaches. That, for example, he vetoes the government's legislation wholesale and not kind of strategically and selectively, because what will that will give them an opportunity to say that the reason that they're unable to move forward with a positive programme, and many people have criticised the government for that and are criticising them for it, is the fact that the president is blocking them. Okay, and that's, I think, the risk for Mr. Nawrocki. If he overplays his hand, if he's not strategic and selective in where he decides to challenge the government, that could then provide them with a narrative that they're having to deal with a blocking president, which could be quite powerful and potentially a winning narrative in the run-up to the next election in 2027.
Just finally and quickly then, Alex, I mean, to follow up on that, when you described Nawrocki winning this big sea-shift referendum against the government, is that what the public perceives here, that Tusk is definitely weakened, the system broken, or could this also be a sort of welcoming of a separation of powers, at least if the two in some ways try to work together?
All the polling suggests that it's the first interpretation is what the public has of it. People are dissatisfied with the government. They're dissatisfied with Mr. Tusk. If there was an election held now, the parties that make up the governing parties would lose their majority. So I think for all these reasons, the idea that this was a referendum and the government's on the back foot is the correct interpretation of it. As I say, the government's hope is that it can turn the tables at the next election, and whereby Mr. Nawrocki at this election said, you want to vote for me because you don't want to concentrate power in the hands of Mr. Tusk's party, which was what would have happened if his candidate had won. By the time of the next election, he can then turn that on its head and say, actually, if you don't want to concentrate power in the hands of the right-wing Law and Justice Party, you need to vote for us to stay in government. So I think that's his best hope, and I think over time, that's what he must be hoping, that people, the desire to have power shared in Poland and not concentrated, is something that he can actually turn to his advantage in 2 years' time.
Alex Szczerbiak, author of the Polish Politics blog. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Time now for the latest business news headlines with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. Ewan, good to have you back on the show. We were talking yesterday about global stocks being in a pretty good position. They're extending a record surge today. Optimism with the prospects of a rate cut from the US Federal Reserve next month. What was that the trigger for this latest rally or something else?
Yeah, another good day for global stocks, trading near their record highs today. And with the US stock market accounting for roughly 2/3 of all global market value, this is a story of more gains and more optimism from the United States. Now, we've had a summer of rates on hold in the US. Traders, though, are now betting there is a 90% chance of an interest rate cut by the Federal Reserve in September. There's even talk that it could be a jumbo cut, a 0.5 percentage point rather than a quarter. Now, that is not the central expectation, but it's certainly the preference of the White House. The Treasury Secretary has been out and about calling for that larger reduction. Now, the big trigger for all of this was yesterday's US inflation data. Underlying US inflation, that's excluding volatile food and energy prices, accelerated to the strongest pace since the start of the year. Now, on the face of it, that is not good news. But the positive takeaway is that tariff-driven pressures are still looking very muted in the US. If you dig into the data, you can see that household furniture, mostly imported and subject to tariffs, is showing signs of inflation. But other tariff-exposed sectors, including new cars and clothing, well, those prices are just not going up. In fact, ironically, it's the services sector which is showing the worst signs of inflation at the moment. Now, that will concern the Fed, but it's fair to say that tariffs can't get the blame for that.
Maybe not, but I do still have to ask. It's always surprising having this conversation. I mean, even if the July data doesn't show it, the tariffs are all still coming into effect. We've just had the tariff deadline. Canada has a massive tariff on it, as does India and other countries. Is there not an expectation that this might feed through a little bit later?
Well, Chris, I'm not going to stick my neck out as to say which of those tariffs are actually going to come into place, because I think that is a bit of a mug's game. But it's certainly true that the US tariff rate is much higher than it has been for decades. So somebody is paying all of these tariffs. The US government is collecting, as Donald Trump wanted, a load of money from tariffs. Now, where that money is coming from, it looks at the moment, it is not the US consumer. Some of it is being paid by exporters at the other side of the world, and some of it is being absorbed by US companies. We've seen some of that from earnings reports. We've seen that some companies are having their profits squeezed by paying some of these tariffs. But at the moment, it is not looking like it's being fed through to the consumer. Now, if you're going to cast your mind perhaps forward 6 months or so, and tariffs may well be higher, whether companies will continue absorbing those costs, I think, is a key question. There was a report from economists at Goldman Sachs, widely attacked by Donald Trump yesterday on social media, which said that the tariff feed-through is still yet to come, and it warned that something nasty could be coming down the track. But I think at the moment it is all projection, and so far the evidence of what's actually happening, well, it looks pretty okay at the moment.
All projection and optimism for the moment. Ewan, one other story you wanted to bring our attention to. It's very hot here in London again today. It's been a pretty hot summer in general, and you have a story about air conditioning in Europe.
Yeah, it's been lovely, hasn't it? Well, I mean, I like a nice warm summer, but temperatures in Europe have been rising at a faster pace in recent years than the global average. Not so good if you don't like the heat. And now there are increasing signs that countries that traditionally don't have aircon, such as France here in the UK, and even some Scandinavian nations, are starting to take up the habit. Now, the shift reflects a new climate reality. The extreme heat is no longer really rare across much of Europe, and it is increasingly the new norm. In Bordeaux this week, temperatures reached a record 41 degrees, and historic buildings like the Chateau Montbrison have been forced to adapt. Early this year, the owners installed air conditioning, discreetly, of course, to preserve the chateau's traditional charm. But there's data to back up this story as well. Daikin, one of the continent's biggest aircon manufacturers, say that sales have doubled since 2010. And this is a fascinating stat from France. According to estimates from Hitachi, half of all households in France will have air conditioning by 2030. Back in 2016, that was just 14%. Now, all of this, of course, is a massive headache for power grids and generators. Suddenly, they're facing days of surging demand in the summer, as well as the usual supply crunch that they face on cold winter days.
The booming business of air conditioning. Let's hope they keep it at least a little bit lower than in the US. That was Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing. Finally, on today's show, Cape Town has long been regarded as one of the best food destinations on the continent, with a host of covetable spots, including Luke Dale Roberts' Potluck Club. With the global demand rising for his celebrated small plate menu, Potluck is taking over the Waldorf Hilton for a 3-month residency from today. Luke Dale Roberts popped into Midori House ahead of the opening to join Monocle's Tom Webb to talk more about Cape Town's booming culinary scene.
I've been there 18 years and started off for me as quite kind of niche, like fine dining was quite niche, quite small, not many places doing it, but it's literally exploded in the time that I'm there. From a producer level, supplier level, chef level, there's a plethora of excellent restaurants doing really, really great food and great service. And the South Africans are generally very welcoming and very, just lovely to work with.
And were you personally part of that momentum? Because, of course, the Potluck Club, huge place, so popular. Did you help drive this change?
I think I did to a certain extent. I mean, I opened the Test Kitchen 2010, the Potluck Club a year and a half later, and I've had hundreds of chefs, waiters, managers come through the doors in the 18 years that I've been there, and a lot of them have gone on to open their own places, and it's actually beautiful to see. It's been a really lovely circular process,
What kind of customer is coming in and out your doors?
So all walks of life. We've got 3 restaurants. We've got Test Kitchen Fledglings, which is an upliftment project, which focuses on just excellent, delicious food, anything from a burger all the way to a 5-course set menu. We've got Potluck, which is the rooftop kind of swanky, hip-hop and happening, good cocktails, good food, like global tapas. And then we got Salon, which is the more serious fine dining. So we get all different types coming through. In season, which is generally from, I would say, late October till March, we're 90% foreigners. And then in off-season, we're probably 75% local. We pick up quite a lot of Americans that are coming through for the game drives, because winter in the north is dry, and there's beautiful, clear blue sky, crisp air, and just lovely game watching available at that. So they usually do like 2-3 days in Cape Town and then off to the north.
Now, before we leave Cape Town and head to London, you were mentioning the chefs coming in and out your doors. What is the hospitality scene like for employment? How are you retaining talent? How are you bringing in and encouraging new chefs?
So what we do at Test Kitchen Fledglings is we basically have mentors and fledglings, and we bring in people that typically have had no formal experience in the hospitality industry. We generally sponsor them to go to a school part-time, and we do on-the-job training. And then that's become a very good feeder for the other restaurants, that they grow up in a kind of, not mollycoddle, but like a comfortable environment, and then when they're ready to fly, they either go to another restaurant or they go to one of our other restaurants. But I'm very much a supporter of training people from scratch.
Now, that could be London, because selfishly, I'm very excited that the Potluck Club has finally arrived in London. Why now? Tell us a little bit about this.
So I've been chatting to the Hilton Group for a number of years now. I initiated conversations in COVID because I was like, oh my God, like everything's closed. I need to open something in the Seychelles. And I managed to get hold of a guy called Tobias, who's the development executive. I don't know exactly what his title is, but he deals with new products within the group. And we've chatted sporadically over the years, and he came to me with this London Waldorf option, and I was like, how cool would that be to do something back in London and with a big, name and group behind us to kind of springboard it, and a very cool, strong infrastructure within the hotel that can accommodate, us and help us.
Now, is this an infrastructure you're familiar with? Because you are a British chef, despite a slight South African twang. How is it reconnecting back to the London scene? Has it changed? Does it feel good?
The London scene's blowing up. I was here a couple of weeks ago on holiday, actually, and Jesus, you can spend some money if you want to, eh? But what's lovely about the food scene in London is you've got fine dining, but you've got all these individual, whether it be ethnic or European or Mediterranean style restaurants that are very unique to that particular food style. So you can really explore. I was walking around near Bankside yesterday and I found a momo store where they did like the Nepalese momos, and I was like, how cool is that? You know, like that's super niche, you know.
How are you bringing that dynamic to your menu? What's on your menu list?
So we picked what we call the family favourites from the potluck menu in Cape Town, which are the big hitters that have been on the menu for a number of years. Things like a beautiful piece of beef lightly smoked with a black pepper and truffle cafe au lait, simple, just beef and good sauce. We do some little fish sliders with a miso mayo, coriander mojo. So the Potluck Club is very global. I, as a chef, really enjoy exploring every single angle and every single culture that I can when I'm experimenting with food. And Potluck was really an opportunity to do that. And so you can go Middle Eastern one day, you can go Spanish the next day, you can go like Cape Malay from South Africa the next day. There's no handcuffs on what we do.
Now, like your menu, our listenership here on Monocle Radio is very global, and I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested in how you were able to build a global restaurant brand.
Well, I think it just involves a lot of like hard work, and I think the objective was never to be global, but I think that, you know, whether it be accolades or global recognition or whatever, it's just a result of like day by day just putting your best foot forward and doing the most beautiful food you can and making sure that it's well served. And then the byproduct is, you know, accolades, etc.
Now, finally, if you were to pick your dream location for your next opening, where and why would that be?
I think it would be, I have no idea. It would be nice to do something in the Seychelles so I could take a holiday every year and enjoy that. And it's only 3-4 hours from Cape Town. But I'm really, really, above all else, I'm excited to be in London doing something in an iconic capital city in the world and somewhere which is super close to my heart.
Luke Dale Roberts there of the Potluck Club speaking to Tom Webb at Midori House. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Henry King and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye and thanks for listening.